Hey, so today we are reading from Am I Blue? Coming Out from the Silence. The short story is Three Mondays in July by James Cross Giblin. Summer 1951. No Walkmans, no VCRs. Television was still a novelty, and not many homes had sets. It was before the Beatles, before Elvis. The word gay meant merry, happy, light-hearted, according to Webster's. If people talked about homosexuals, which they rarely did, homosexuality was virtually a forbidden topic. They called them queers, fairies, dykes, or more politely, deviates. But in big cities and small towns across America, there were many young men and women who found themselves responding to members of their own sex. Could you give me a minute here, David? It was his mother, calling from the kitchen, and she didn't sound as if she would take no for an answer. David turned away from his bedroom window, which faced the street. Be right there as soon as I finish making my bed, he called back. He pulled the bottom sheet tight before looking out the window again. Across the street, a boy David didn't know was mowing old Mrs. Herrendine's lawn. The boy looked older than David, maybe 18, and he was certainly stockier. He had removed his shirt on this sticky July afternoon, and the sunlight slanting between the maple leaves highlighted the muscles in his broad back. David felt perspiration break out on his forehead as he watched the boy. The air was close in the bedroom, but David knew that wasn't the reason why for his sudden warmth. He remembered the summer before when another boy had mown Mrs. Herrendine's lawn and clipped her hedges, and David, watching from the privacy of the spare bedroom window upstairs, had felt the heat rise in his body and had begun to fondle himself. Enough of that. David forced his gaze away from the window and drew the chenille spread up over the narrow bed. There was a different summer, and it had been a long time since he had retreated to the room upstairs, supposedly to look through the old books and magazines that were stored there. Now he had his driver's license and a full-time summer job at the library. The same urges still rose in him, fiercely, unpredictably, but it was easier to subdue them, most of the time. David didn't know why he responded so strongly to the sight of the male body. He simply did, and as far back as he could remember, and had as far back as long as he could remember. What he did know, from things he'd read and remarks he'd overheard at school, was that most people thought such feelings were shameful, even evil, so he tried his best to suppress them. Finishing with the bed, David left his room, crossed a corner of the dining room, and entered the kitchen. In their 100-year-old house, most rooms were on the ground floor. Well, that took you long enough, his mother said. She finished drying the last of the lunch plates and set it on the stack in the cupboard. I stopped to read Paul's postcard again, David said. Paul was David's best friend, off on a vacation trip in New England with his family. His mother gave David a quizzical look, as if she sensed he wasn't telling her the truth. It made him wonder again how much she knew about his fantasies, his secrets. Had she guessed why he used to spend so much time upstairs? I'll bet I know what you want me to do, he said, hoping to lighten the mood and gain the initiative. Oh, you do? She brushed a loose strand of gray hair back in place. Weed the rock garden, right? You must have read my mind, she smiled. Good, David thought. Now he might have a chance to do what he really wanted that afternoon. First, though, I'd like to drive over to the beach for a while, he said. Her smile started to fade. Don't worry, I'll only be gone an hour or so, I promise. At that point, another son might have hugged his mother to reinforce his vow, but neither David nor his mother were huggers. Instead, they simply stood there in the kitchen looking at one another in a quiet contest of wills. David won. Well, all right, his mother said. After all, it is your day off from the library, and it would probably be better to do the weeding later when the sun isn't so high in the sky. She smiled again. We wouldn't want you getting sunstroke. The low-lying shore of Lake Erie was just 2 miles from David's home in the suburb town of Sainsbury, named for a pioneer settler in northeastern Ohio. As David drove past small farms with stands displaying homegrown tomatoes, he relaxed in the driver's seat. Traffic was light, so he could afford to let his mind wander. There was no radio in the Ford two-door, but David didn't mind. He was just glad they lived so close to town that his father could walk him to and from his office. Otherwise, David wouldn't have had the use of family car on these summer afternoons. David slowed as a yellow cat streaked across the country road. He wondered what his friend Paul was doing in that moment. He'd be in Boston now, staying with his grandparents. And if David knew Paul, he'd be trying to get out of some sightseeing trip so that he could go to a first-run movie at one of the big downtown theaters. "You gotta see A Place in the Sun," Paul had written on the postcard he'd sent from Northampton. "The close-ups of Elizabeth Taylor and Montgomery Clift are just incredible." David never had a friend like Paul before. In fact, until Paul showed up in homeroom last fall, David had never known another boy who shared his love for movies, books, and plays. He thought he was the only one in Sainsbury who kept up with the Broadway theater by reading the Sunday New York Times. A pair of gulls flew low over the marsh on the left side of the road. It wasn't far to the beach from there. If Paul were with him now, David thought, they'd be planning an expedition to Cleveland to see the new French movie that had just opened. Or they'd be discussing Henry James's story, Washington Square, which they'd both read after seeing the film version, The Heiress, but they wouldn't be talking about anything more personal. They never did. Paul and he shared so many interests that David often wondered if his wiry, dark-haired friend shared some of the same fantasies, too. Lying in bed alone at night, did Paul, like David, visualize male bodies? Sometimes those of movie stars like Tyrone Power, sometimes those of muscular boys he knew. But David had never had the courage to hint at the subject, let alone bring it up directly. Ahead on the right loomed the gate to the state park. As David turned off the paved highway, waves of dust rose from the dirt road that led to the beach. The trees on either side gave way to scraggly bushes, and then the lake came into view, its calm surface glimmering in the mid-afternoon light. Since it was Monday, there weren't many cars in the parking lot. David found a good spot in one of the few shady patches. Before getting out of the car, he slipped off his loafers and socks and rolled up his khaki slacks. He hadn't brought a beach towel because he didn't plan to stretch out on the sand, and he didn't intend to go in the water because he'd never learned how to swim. Instead, he'd do what he most enjoyed: walk past the concession stand in the section near the parking lot where most people clustered and explore the dunes at the far end of the beach. He started out along the road, a dirt track really, that skirted the back of the beach. Before long, he passed the last of the sunbathers and swimmers. Now the beach was marked by clumps of grass and piles of small rocks. Here, David could walk alone and daydream about the roles he would act on the stage one day, about the great plays he would write. He had already begun to get leading parts in the drama club productions at school. The dirt track narrowed further. A stand of poplars loomed on David's right, and beyond them the sand rose and fell in a series of dunes. He left the track and had started toward the dunes when a sudden movement caught his eye. He stopped behind one of the trees and peered around it. Who could be there? No one ever came to this part of the beach. While David watched, a man slowly rose from the hollow between two dunes. He stood with hands on hips and stared out at the lake. The man had his back to David, and the sun glistened from the beginning of a bald spot on the top of his head. Although it sported a nut-brown tan, the man's body was far from perfect. His shoulders sloped and his long arms were lightly muscled. Even so, David felt his heart beat more rapidly as he watched him. For the man was wearing snug black swim trunks, the briefest trunks David had ever seen except on actors in Italian movies. The man glanced to his left and then to the right, but did not turn around. If he had, he would most certainly have seen David. The man took off his wristwatch and knelt in the hollow to put it away. David could just make out the top of a beach bag. Then the man strode down to the shore, deserted at this point, and walked straight into the water. David hunkered down on the ground behind the tree and kept his gaze fixed on the man's head in the water. From that distance it looked like a dark ball bobbing up and down on the surface. David's right calf began to cramp, and he could feel sweat gathering behind his knees. But he did not change position. If anyone had asked him what he was waiting for, he could not have answered. All he knew was that he felt compelled to wait and watch. After what seemed like an hour, but was probably no more than 20 minutes, the man emerged from the water. He slicked back his thinning hair and walked slowly, deliberately toward the hollow. Pat made himself as small as possible behind the tree and studied the man. A coating of gray-black hair covered his chest, and his wet trunk seemed even briefer than before. David felt a wave of heat spread up through his body, and it alarmed him. Why was he so fascinated by this stranger? The man had reached the hollow by now and was rubbing himself down with an aqua beach towel. Finishing, he looked to left and right once more as if to make sure he was alone. Then, as David stared unbelievably, the man rolled his trunks down over his hips and stepped out of them. David's breath caught in his chest. Other than the guys in gym class, he had never seen a naked man before, not even his father, and he had certainly never imagined he would see one out on a public beach. He felt as if he should avert his gaze and focus on something else, the gnarled branches of a shrub or the small white blossoms on a wild flower, but he could not make himself look at anything except the man's bronzed body. The man turned, then, and prepared to stretch out on the towel. David tried to back away before the man could see him, but his awkward movement attracted the man's attention. "What the hell?" he exclaimed. David scrambled to his feet, and for a moment his gaze locked with the man's startled brown eyes. Then, without saying anything, David walked swiftly away along the dirt road. He thought the man might call after him, stop him. He almost hoped he would. However, no words came as David put more distance between him and the hollows. The afternoon sun beat down on his head, but something else was making his face flush. He felt guilty, as if he'd been caught doing something terrible. But what exactly? When he reached another stand of trees, he stopped and looked back toward the dunes. There was no sign of the man. Had he packed up his gear and gone in the opposite direction while David had been walking? Or was he stretched out on his towel in the hollow? David felt his breath catch again as he imagined the second possibility, and for a moment he thought of retracing his steps to find out. "Don't be a fool," he said to himself. "You were embarrassed once. Do you want to be embarrassed again?" He swung around and headed in the opposite direction, toward the parking lot. He told his mother he would be gone no more than an hour, and an hour and a half had passed already. David crossed the parking lot, unlocked the car, and put on his loafers. The tops of his feet stung. He'd probably be sunburned there tomorrow. As he started the engine, he thought again of the man at the hollow. Did he come there often? Would he be there next Monday? Would he... No, I mustn't think about that, David told himself angrily. With the screech of tires, he backed out of the parking space and turned toward home. "Where were you off to this afternoon?" his mother asked. It was the following Monday, and she was sitting in the living room reading a biography of Marie Antoinette. "I thought I'd go back to the beach," David replied from the doorway. He kept his voice low and casual. If his mother saw how eager he was to return, she'd be sure to wonder why. She smiled fondly at him. Well, have a good time and don't stay out in the sun too long. You know how easily you burn. Having offered that bit of maternal advice, she opened up her book once more. As he got into the car, David found himself wishing he weren't an only child. Then maybe his mother wouldn't be so concerned about him. But he had to admit that her concern was preferable to his father's seeming lack of interest most of the time. At least his mother appeared to have some idea of who he was. He drove faster than usual, impatient to get to the beach and see if the man was there, all week long, while he'd been putting books back on the shelves at the library, or mowing the backyard, or lying in bed at night. Visions of the man had flashed suddenly, unexpectedly into his thoughts. Over and over he saw the man's back, watched him swim, and held his breath as the man slowly removed his trunks. The visions troubled David, and he tried to stop them, to think of other things. But they only returned, more insistently than before. Now they were impelling him back to the beach in hopes of what? What did he want from the man? David honestly didn't know. In the parking lot, after slipping out of his loafers, David also pulled off his slacks. Today, he had put on his baggy blue gym shorts under them. He was almost running by the time he started down the dirt track toward the dunes and forced himself to slow down. Up ahead, he saw the hollow. Would the man be there? Cautiously, David approached the stand of trees from which he'd watched the man the week before. He bent down and moved slowly, soundlessly, as if he were on a reconnaissance mission. Well, I am, in a way, he thought. He positioned himself behind a tree and looked out at the hollow. There was no movement there, no sign of life. He scanned the dunes on either side and the lake ahead. Nothing there either. No strollers on the sand, no swimmers in the water. He sat back. Maybe the man hadn't arrived yet, or maybe he was stretched out at the bottom of the hollow, sunning himself. Would he be wearing the black bikini or lying there in the nude? David felt his forehead grow hot as he visualized the scene. He waited. He waited some more. Gulls screeched overhead. A bee buzzed around a clump of beech clover. David shifted his position, but it didn't help much. His scalp prickled from the heat, and his legs began to ache. At last he stood up. Checking his watch, he was surprised to see that 40 minutes had passed. If the man was in the hollow, he surely would have moved by now. But David felt himself to check, to see for himself. Boldness seemed the best course of action. He wouldn't sneak up on the hollow. Instead, he'd walk straight up to it, and if the man were there, David would act as if he were simply heading down to the water. Feeling more confident, he left the security of trees and set out between the dunes. The hollow was empty. David ached with the disappointment, a disappointment so fierce that he almost felt like crying. He had so much wanted the man to be there. Why? He still did not know. It wasn't that the man was handsome, because he wasn't, not really, and he wasn't young either. No, David's fascination with him stemmed from something else, a mysterious and powerful force that David had never experienced before. Not with the boys he'd watched from a window, not with Paul, not with anyone. For a moment, he stretched out full length in the hollow and stared at a cloud that was passing over the sun. Instead of a lanky boy in a wrinkled shirt and baggy shorts, David imagined what it would be like to be the man, lying there in his sleek bikini. The fantasy was alarming, and David stood up quickly before it got the better of him. The beach was no place to fool around. What if someone should see him? Itching with frustration, David returned to the dirt track and headed for the parking lot. He looked back once at the hollow, but of course no one was there. When David woke up the following Monday, dark clouds hung low in the sky, and it looked as if it might rain any minute. Damn! Even though the man hadn't shown up the week before, David had convinced himself that he'd be on the beach today. But he certainly wouldn't come if it was raining. At first, David snapped At breakfast, David snapped at his mother when she asked him if he wanted jam on his toast. Afterward, to make up, he volunteered to weed the flower beds. "Why don't you wait and see if it rains?" she says. "No, I'll do it now. Anything would be better than sitting around the house on this gloomy day. But maybe the sun will come out later. If it does, I want to go to the beach." David's voice was louder than he intended, and he looked quickly to see if his mother had picked up his agitation. The last thing he needed was for her to start asking questions about the beach and what he did there. She merely poured herself another cup of coffee and said, "Well, let's hope you get what you want." The sun broke through the clouds a little before lunch, and David set out for the beach as soon as he could afterward. Once he was in the car, he unbuttoned the top 2 buttons on his sports shirt. The light breeze blowing through the window felt good on his exposed chest. When David reached the screen of trees on the beach, he looked toward the hollow. There was no sign of the man, but David felt oddly unconcerned. For some reason he couldn't have explained, he was sure he'd see the man again that day. He unfolded the large bath towel he had brought with him and spread it on the sand in front of the trees. Their fluttering leaves partially shielded him from the sun after he stretched out on the towel. He unbuttoned the rest of the buttons on his shirt, but didn't take it off. Why risk getting a burn on his chest and shoulders? He didn't know how long he'd dozed when the sting of a sandfly awakened him. Brushing it away from his neck, he looked about dazedly and saw the man standing in the hollow. He was wearing the same black bikini as before, and he was looking in David's direction. Suddenly shy, David lowered his gaze. When he raised his eyes again, the man had turned away and was rubbing suntan lotion on his arms. That done, he knelt down in the hollow and disappeared from view. David rose to his haunches on the towel and sat there, hugging his knees and staring in the direction of the hollow. As the minutes passed, he lost all sense of time. He longed to make a move, but where could he go? He didn't want to retreat to the trees and was afraid to move closer to the man. His entire being seemed to be concentrated on waiting. At last, almost as if willed by David, the man raised himself on his elbows and looked over at the rim of the hollow. "What do you want, kid?" he asked abruptly. "Why are you spying on me?" "I wasn't spying," David said. "I just..." "Just what?" I... David couldn't stop stammering. The man stood up and brushed off his legs. "I hope you didn't tell anyone you saw me sunbathing in the nude," he said. "You know, I could get arrested for that." No, of course I didn't." David hugged his knees tighter. Well, who did the man think he was? Besides, whom would he tell? The man seemed to sense his discomfort. He walked over to David's towel and crouched down near him. When he spoke again, his voice was softer. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to accuse you of anything," he said. "It's just that I'm a stranger around here and I don't know what's safe and what isn't." "You surprised me, that's all," David said. "I'd never seen anyone take off his trunks on the beach before." And as soon as the words were out of his mouth, David realized how silly they must sound. But the man simply smiled. "Don't tell me you were turned on by seeing an old guy like me," Bear asked. "You're not old," David exclaimed. "Thanks, kid, but I'm 38, and that's a hell of a lot older than you." "I'll be 17 next month," David said defensively. Without meaning to, he found himself staring at the man's form-fitting trunks. He might as well be naked now, considering how little of his body the trunks concealed. Embarrassed by his own thought, David looked quickly away, but the man knew what was going on. "That's okay," he said gently. "Okay?" David's voice quivered. "You can look at my body all you want. I'm flattered." David let out a great sigh. He hadn't realized he'd been holding his breath. "You've got a good body yourself," the man said, "from what I can see of it." Good body? No one had ever told David that before. He himself thought his arms were too spindly, his chest too thin. But if this man said... David turned to him and examined his face more closely. After all, the man had given him permission to do so. He noticed the smile lines, or were they lines of worry, around his eyes and the dimple in his chin. The man returned David's gaze directly and then stood up. What would happen next? David wondered. Would the man reach out to him, touch him? Would he suggest that they drive someplace where they could be alone, the way actors did in movies? David had no real notion of what might transpire, but his skin tingled with a mixture of excitement and fear. "It's hot back here by the trees," the man said. He swatted a sand fly that was biting his arm. "What say we take a walk down by the water?" A vague disappointment replaced his earlier excitement as David stood up also. There was no privacy down by the water. Again, the man seemed to sense what David was thinking. He touched his shoulder lightly, sending a shiver down David's arm. "I think I know what you want, kid, what you've been hoping for," he said. "I haven't been hoping for anything," David started to protest. He felt as if the man had suddenly stripped him bare. I know," the man said, "but this isn't the right place, and I'm not the right person." He went on quickly, before David could interrupt. "That doesn't mean I don't like you and think you're handsome, because I do." Handsome? Had David heard him correctly? "But I have to leave soon," the man was saying. "So do you want to go for that walk or not?" David nodded. "By the way, my name's Alan. What's yours?" "David." "Well, good to meet you, David." The man shook his hand, really gripped it. David could not remember ever receiving such a firm handshake. For the next hour, David and Alan strolled along the lake shore. They waded in the cool, shallow water and tried to see who could skip stones the farthest on the lake's placid surface. David learned that Alan was the buyer for the menswear department of a large store in Chicago. That explained the bikini. He'd picked it up on a buying trip to Italy. Alan had come to Sainsbury to see his aunt and uncle. He was returning to Chicago the next day. David, in turn, told Alan about his life. He talked of his aging parents and his friend Paul, and confided his dreams of a career in the theater. Trusting this man who had so recently been a stranger, David went on to tell Alan secret things he'd never told anyone before. He acknowledged that he was a virgin, and, speaking in a whisper, although there was no one else nearby, he told him how fascinated he was by the look and shape of men's bodies. The sun was low in the afternoon sky when Alan skimmed a final stone across the water and turned to David. "I've got to go now," he said. They returned to the hollow, and Alan gathered his things. Even though he knew the answer, David asked the question anyway. "You won't be here next Monday, will you?" "No, I'll be back on the job in Chicago." Alan reached out and clasped David's shoulders. "But why don't you come anyway? A tan would look good on you, and you needn't burn if you're careful." David tried to smile, but it felt forced. He had just begun to get to know Alan. Now he might never see him again. Alan chucked him lightly under the chin. "Don't look so sad, kid. It'll be fine." He picked up his gear and backed away slowly. "Just remember one thing. You're not alone." Alan had said his car was parked at the other end of the beach from David's. David stood, watching as he strode away, and waved in response to Alan's wave before the man disappeared behind a grove of trees. As he headed up the dirt track toward his own car, David felt a strange and welcome exhilaration. Instead of the emptiness he had expected following Alan's departure, he had a sense of fulfillment, of profound satisfaction. "You're not alone," Alan had said, and, maybe for the first time, he didn't feel alone. Unable to repress his joy, he broke into a combination of hopping and skipping, and laughed at his own silliness. He was still skipping when he passed the concession stand. Several of the customers turned to stare, and one little girl asked, "What's the boy doing, Mama?" David didn't mind. He just grinned and waved at the girl and kept on skipping down the road.